Hello student, how are you all? I hope you all are alright. Today we are going to conclude the Age of Shakespeare, and we have already read about the dramas in the Age of Shakespeare. Now we are going to read about the prose. Lilly and other writers of prose fiction. While the Age of Shakespeare found its chief imaginative outlet in the drama, it was also active in the field of prose fiction. It did not indeed produce what we specifically call the novel, by which we mean the long story of contemporary life and manners. This was not established in English literature till more than a century after Shakespeare's death, but in other lines of fictitious narrative considerable progress was made. Some stimulus in this direction was given by work of translators who familiarized the reading public with Spanish and Italian romance and with Italian novel or short stories. The last named have a great secondary interest as the sources upon which the Elizabethan dramatists including Shakespeare, often drew for the materials of their plots. They were also adapted and imitated, and various collections of stories appeared, such as William Pater's Palace of Pleasure, which enjoyed much popularity. The most important prose romance of the period is the work of John Lilly, whose comedies have already been mentioned, Euphues and Anatomy of Wit, and its sequel Euphues and His England. The former were published in 1597 and was therefore exactly contemporary with the Shepherd's Calendar. The latter, the following year, the first part tells of young Athenian named Euphues, wealthy, handsome, and clever, who set out on his travel, reaches Naples, where he became an intimate friend of a certain Philotas, with whom he holds many long conversations on philosophy and ethical subjects, and has several affairs of heart which come to nothing, and in the end return to Athens, leaving behind him a pamphlet or letter addressed to his friend and described as a cooling cadre for Philotas and all fond lovers, the purpose of which is to dissuade him from women's society and the tender passion. It is a sort of love story but without action, and what little narrative there is merely an excuse for endless discourses and moralizing. In the second part of Euphues visits England and gives a long description of the country, the court, and the manner of Islay, which is so unqualified in its praise that could we only take it as truthful, we should be convinced that in Lilly's time our land was paradise and its inhabitants absolute embodiments of all the virtues. The popularity of Euphues was extraordinary. In little more than half a century it went through 10 editions, a great record at that time. Everybody read it who read nothing, and the ladies of the court used it as a moral handbook, a guide to polite behavior, and a model of elegance in speech and writing. It owes its continued fame mainly to its style, enthusiasm for the classics, the influence of Italian and Spanish literature, and a widespread desire to lift and refine the vernacular tongue, led to all kinds of strange experiments in English prose. Lilly's style, or Euphuism as it called, is most remarkable of these. It is characterized in common with other contemporary effort by extreme elaboration and artifice, and as distinguished from them by a number of specific rhetoric devices which give it a quality of its own. It could take too much space to analyze these here, but it is necessary to indicate that most important of them, perhaps the outstanding features of Euphuism, is the excessive use of balance and antithesis. As instant as you may suspect me of idleness in giving ear to talk, so you may convince me of lightness in answering such twice, in which, as will be seen, suspect me and convince me, idleness and lightness, giving ear and answering, talk and twice, are carefully arranged in contrasted pairs. This balanced antithesis is frequently combined with alliteration, as for example, although I have trained my heart as trusty friend, I will shun the heart after as a thoughtless foe. Lily also indulges freely in similes, wordplay, and punnings, while another of his peculiar characteristics is a fondness for natural history, or the natural history not of science but of myth and fable. Thus we read to our astonishment of bird named Etagen, who never singeth any time after she is taken, of a precious gem draconites, which is found in the dragon, of a herb dictanum in which the wounded deer always find an unfailing remedy, and so on. Shakespeare gives us an example of the same sort of fantastic pseudoscience when he writes of the toad as ugly and venomous, but as wearing none the less a precious jewel in his hand. The second place in Elizabethan prose romances may be assigned to Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadia, completed about 1581 though not published till 1613. To some extent, this work carries on the tradition of the older romances of chivalry, while it owes much of its form to the pastoral Dinah of the Portuguese Montemier and the Arcadia of the Italian Sannazaro. Unlike Euphues, in which there is practically no story, it is full of incident. Its principal interest is provided by the adventures of the two friends Pyrolacus and Musidorus, while seeking to win the two Arcadia princes Philoclea and Pamela, but a large number of other characters are introduced, each of whom becomes the center of a separate story, and episode arise within episode to the great complication and confusion of the plot. Though Sidney does not overwork a few rhetoric devices like Lily, his prose is of an extreme ornate and poetical kind, and while striking the beautiful in places, in the long run it becomes wearisome because of its total want of simplicity and restraint. Two of the pre-Shakespearean dramatists whom we have named, Lodge and Greene, have also certain importance as writers of romance. In a general way, they resemble Sidney in the use of person and machinery of conventional pastoralism, but their style is largely fashioned upon that of Lily, each produced amid much other work on one book, which is still in interest, not how other work one book is still interest, not however on account of its intrinsic merit, but because of its connection with Shakespeare. Lodge, Rosalind, Euphues' Golden Legacy furnish the raw material of As You Like It, Green's Pendosto, The Triumph of Time, those of the Windsor Tale, a third of the University which Thomas Nash has a place somewhat apart from at a time when tendency in fiction was almost entirely toward romance. He gave a distinct lead in the direction of realism of a course description. His Unfortunate Traveller or The Life of Jack Wilton, a rambling record of adventure of the continent, is our earliest example of picaresque novel or novel of rascality, a type of fiction which was already popular in Spain and was later to be cultivated with great success by Defoe. Bacon and his essay. We must not suppose that the English literature of the age of Shakespeare was entirely a literature of the imagination. England now felt the stimulus of the Renaissance on the intellectual as well as on the artistic side, and the result was the production of a great many prose works dealing with various subjects in which thoughtful people were then interested. Most of these belong to the special history of such subjects rather than to the general history of literature. But a few writers claim a place in our record, and among them is one of great importance, Bacon, the principal prose master of his time. The second son of the famous lawyer and statesman Francis Bacon was born on 22 January 1561. As a boy, his wit and precocity attracted the attention of the Queen, who used jestingly to call him her young Lord Keeper. His father then being the keeper of the Great Seal of England. He was educated at Trinity College, Cambridge, and in preparation for the career of statesmanship was sent to Paris in the suite of English ambassador. His father's death in 1579 threw him upon his own resources. He chose the law as his profession, was called to the bar in 1582 and became Queen's Counsel in 1589. By this time, he had also made his mark as an orator in the House of Commons. After the accession of the James I, he rose rapidly in favor and fortune. He was knighted in 1603, became Attorney General in 1613, Privy Councillor in 1660, Lord Keeper in 1670, Lord Chancellor and Baron Verulam in 1618, Viscount St Albans in 1621. Then came a sudden crash. He was impeached before the House of Lords on various charges of official malpractice, offered no defence, and was sentenced to a fine of Rs 14,000, imprisonment during the King's pleasure, and perpetual banishment from Parliament and court. This sentence, however, was never carried into effect, and ultimately he received a royal pardon. He spent the few remaining years of his life in scholarly pursuits and died in 1626 from complications arises from a cold caught while he was making a scientific experiment. His character was compounded of contradiction and inconsistencies. He believed himself born for the service of mankind and sincerely desired to devote his wonderful powers to the advancement of that knowledge which would lead to the glory of Creator and the relief of man's state. Yet in practice he sacrificed much for the sake of wealth and power and the satisfaction of his inordinate ambitions, while his moral teaching too often resolved itself into the narrowest expediency and utilitarian moral teaching and utilitarianism. He wrote voluminously on many subjects, and his greatest work, his Advancement of Learning, and his Novum Organum, New Organ or Instrument, in which he sets forth and illustrates the inductive of Baconian method of studying nature, place him in the front rank of the world's epoch maker. But these belonging to the history not of general literature but of science and philosophy. His principal contribution to general literature in his little collection of essay or counsels civil and moral, first published in 1597 and in much enlarged edition in 1612 and 1625. The writing of these essays was doubtless suggested by essays of a great French thinker Montaigne, but both the matter and the manner of them are entirely Bacon's own. It should be noted that, like Montaigne, he uses the word essay in its original etymological sense, now almost lost, and as equivalent to essay, a trial or attempt. The essay therefore are intended merely a dispersed meditations or informal thoughts on the subject dealt with, not as exhaustive treatises truly practical in character. They concern themselves for the most part with the conduct of life in private and public affairs, and thus with things which come home to man's business and bosoms. Extraordinary insight and sagacity are their silent qualities. Beyond perhaps any other books of the same size in any literature, they are loaded with the ripest wisdom of experience, but we must never forget that the wisdom which they inculcate is on the whole of a distinctly worldly kind, though according to his first biographer Bacon, in writing them he did rather drive at a masculine and clear expression than at any finesse or affectation of phrases. His style nonetheless is marked by the general ornateness and fondness for imagery, the love of analogy and metaphor, which were so much in the taste of the time. It is also very highly Latinized, but its most important characteristic is its marvelous terseness and epigrammatic force. Bacon had an almost unrivaled power of packing his thoughts into the smallest possible space and adapting a phrase. In Marlowe's Jew of Malta, we may therefore describe these essays as infinite riches in a little room. Other prose of the period, the varied interests of the time, are well represented in its prose literature. History was cultivated by many writers, among them Raleigh in his vast and uncritical history of the world 1614, Bacon in his judicial history of the reign of Henry VII 1622, Fox in his thoroughly untrustworthy Acts and Monuments or Book of Martyrs 1563, and Raphael Holinshed in his Chronicle of England, Scotland and Ireland, a work which Shakespeare often laid under contribution in his historical plays. At a time when the spirit of adventure was strong, the literature of travel naturally flourished, and of his one special famous work, Richard Hakluyt's principal navigations, voyage, traffic and discoveries of the English nation, may be cited as an example. In the field of theology, a great deal of important work was done, and while this does not properly concern us here, the Mastery Ecclesiastical Polity 1594 to 1907 of Richard Hooker may be mentioned in passing for the sake of his style, which, though still over rhetoric and involved, is generally plainer and simpler than most contemporary prose. In this context, we must recall the authorized version of the Bible 1611, which from the date of its appearance onward has never ceased to exercise a profound influence upon English writing. From the point of view of literary history, there is also great significance in the development of literature of criticism, for this shows that people were beginning to be interested in the forms and principles of literature as an art. The best known of these early treatises is Sidney's Apology for Poetry. Other similar works of some importance are William Webb's Discourse of English Poetry and George Putnam's Art of English Poetry. Tables of the Age of Shakespeare